So apologies for not doing any videos recently. I've just had a lot of things going on, not really had a chance to do much. I do hope to maybe do another Men of War video soon, so if you are waiting patiently, then thank you, I appreciate it, and I do hope to get something out there. But like I say, unfortunately I just don't have as much time at the moment to commit to videos, and they do take a long time to do. So anyway, I'm going to just do a little review here of a book I've recently finished called Tank Men, and it's sort of relevant to a lot of the stuff I do for YouTube in terms of the Men of War stuff. It's sort of relevant with regards to World War II era tanks in particular. So this is a really good study of tank warfare, essentially a history of tank warfare, and it was published I think in 2009 and written by a historian, Robert Kershaw, and it's a very well received book, very well reviewed, from what I've seen at least, and quite rightly so. It's a fantastic book, and I think if any of my subscribers, particularly those of you who are interested in tanks in general, tank combat, particularly with a sort of World War II dynamic, then I would highly recommend this book. I'm sure there are many books about tanks out there that are good, but this just happens to be one of the ones I've read, and I would say it's probably my favourite up to date. And it's very informative, very educational. It covers a lot of ground I didn't really know much about, mostly to do with World War II. There's a short section about the Gulf War in the 90s, the first Gulf War. A lot about basically the technology involved, and essentially the way that the Russian old Soviet I think they were mostly T-72s, were just obliterated by the might of Allied armour at the time, or the coalition armour, mostly US and British stuff. But most of the book is about World War II, and it's sort of written in a chronological order really, and it starts off with World War One, and it goes into a lot of detail about early tank combat and how tanks were originally invented and pioneered by the Brits during the First World War as a kind of breakthrough weapon, which was simply designed to push through no man's land and act as a sort of basically a shield for bullets, really, nothing really more than that. But the tank's role kept evolving, and generals started to realise they could do more with this big cumbersome vehicle, and they wanted more powerful weaponry on it, better armour. But in those days, one of the things the book really goes into detail on, and something that you just don't really think about, is in those days, and even during World War II, really tanks were not designed with people in mind. So crews were usually not really given much thought. These tanks were designed without any comfort factor, really. The insides of them were just hideously dangerous. You could just rub yourself against machinery, hot steel plates, anything, fast-moving objects of any description, and eventually you're going to do yourself harm in that situation, particularly if the tank's moving fast on rocky terrain, heat of combat, where you're not really thinking straight, you're not focusing on small things. It's really dangerous stuff, and there were a horrible amount of casualties just in relation to moving around in a tank, trying to actually keep yourself alive by holding on to things and not getting thrown around the place left, right and centre. So early tanks were pretty horrific things to be in, really, particularly for prolonged periods. But the book then covers the World War One stuff, a little bit of an interesting section about the first ever tank-on-tank battle, which took place in World War One. The German A7V took on one of the British tanks, the Mark One, or a couple of them, in fact. And the book then moves on to World War Two, and it does a very good job at covering the build-up to World War Two, and you really kind of get to understand why German tank design was way ahead, really. The thing is, it's a misconception, I think, to say it was completely ahead, because actually it wasn't. And this is one of the interesting things about the book that you learn is the early phases of World War Two. the Germans actually didn't have a superior tank to even the French or the Czechs. The best vehicle at the time was the French tank, the Char B, which I think was designed by Renault, and that was the most sophisticated tank in the world, I think, pretty much. And funnily enough, the Sherman was modelled on the Char B, the US Sherman. But the problem, of course, was that the Char B was very sophisticated, but the French didn't really deploy them correctly, and their tactics were just plain wrong. They didn't understand the meaning of combined arms assaults, and really, what the book really goes into detail on is how, during the initial phases of World War II, the reasons the Germans were so successful was because they managed to deploy tanks correctly. Their panzer divisions were used in a sensible way, in a modern, smart way, and the French and the Brits and all the other opponents at the time needed to catch up. And the Brits, it was interesting because really the Brits pioneered tank warfare, and all of the books about tank warfare through the 20s and right up into the 30s were mostly written by British generals or ex-military people or just enthusiasts or whoever you like. But the government just didn't want to spend the money, and as a result of that, British tank design and sort of, I guess, specialism kind of declines, expertise declines, and they went into World War II without anywhere near as much prep as was needed. They were simply just not prepared for it at the time, and that was the mistake of politicians first and foremost. It was a colossal failing on the part of politicians at the time. But World War One was extremely costly, and there just wasn't the appetite to spend money on military. There was just the appetite really to do the bare minimum and to keep the empire going, really, but without having too much of a sort of war-ready culture. And obviously in Germany the opposite was going on. So the book covers a lot about that. It covers how Blitzkrieg really was effective, and a common theme of the book is how the Flak 88 and Stuka dive bombers were really the best two weapons that the Germans had throughout World War II. They were the most effective, and they were really the two instruments that the Germans used to great effect to sweep through France, sweep through many countries, sweep through Russia during the initial phases of Barbarossa. So and that's not something that's necessarily new to me. I did know about the effectiveness of those weapons, but it's when you read first-hand accounts of combat that went on, you realise that the veterans, a common theme is always that actually the formidable weapons were the Flak 88 and Stuka dive bombers. They were the things that they were pretty terrified of, really. So panzers, although extremely effective and very powerful vehicles, during the early stages of World War II, the first few years at least, they were not a lot better than the French and British armour or Russian armour. In fact, they were probably inferior, but it was near the end of the war where the Germans really decided to roll out the big monster tanks, such as the Tigers, the King Tigers, the Panthers, and it was all as a result of what was happening at the time. It was a reaction to the T-34 and to the British Matilda tank, which was actually a very effective tank during the early years of World War II. And the book goes into a lot of detail about the North African front during the war, and I didn't really know. I know a bit about it, but I didn't know a great deal about it. And that's an often overlooked part of World War II history, the battle for North Africa. Rommel going in, trying to basically take over from the Italians, who initially got completely devastated by the British, who sweep through North Africa to defend Cairo and to hold their position, basically maintain their strongholds. And it was a bit of a to and fro affair, and ultimately it led to the failing on Rommel's part to take El Alamein, which was a very decisive battle and arguably one of the big turning points of World War II, really. So that was interesting, and it was very interesting to see how the Brits adapted, and initially they were not prepared for war, but by about 1942, 1943, they were very much in the fight and throwing out some pretty decent armour. The Valentine tank, for example, was pretty good. Matildas, and eventually they got access to things like the US Grant tank and Sherman, which was the sort of mass-produced vehicle. And that was essentially a tactic that arguably won World War II, just mass production of vehicles that were not necessarily superior to the enemy armour, but certainly weren't superior to the enemy armour, but there were 5 of them against 1 every time. And it goes into detail about the Eastern Front as well, which obviously no tank book is going to overlook the Eastern Front, and very interesting accounts of that. How there was a certain account of a Russian KV-1 tank that was able to take, I think it was something ridiculous like 30 or so German panzers. This KV-1 managed to take out, held an entire attack at bay for days on end. The Germans threw everything they could at this vehicle and couldn't disable it, and it terrified them when they first encountered it. This behemoth monster Russian armour. So they had to adapt and they had to change their tactics. So it was an arms race. I mean, tank warfare is an arms race. It's about building a bigger gun and more thicker armour, faster, more reliable engine, better crew space, bigger crew, etc., etc. It's just endless. And it's just a fantastic book. I mean, one thing I would like to say, just to maybe finalise this review, is it's actually a very difficult book to read, and I wasn't actually prepared for that. But it's actually very sad, and because it's an account of first-hand veterans, what actually happened, their accounts of and memories of tank action they saw. It's very graphic in its portrayal of what actually happens in tank combat. Computer games just simply don't capture the reality of what happens when you're in essentially a steel box and projectiles are being fired at you, white hot metals bouncing around, and it's nasty stuff, tank combat, and the injuries are just horrific. And the description in the book, there are times where I was wincing and had to stop reading because it's just extremely visceral the way it's described, and just horrific, like people getting run over by tanks and essentially turned into mush, and people being dismembered in all manner of horrific ways as a result of blasts and fires and bailing from tanks. And bailing from tanks is a big factor in all of this, and it was something that the German tanks were better designed for bailing, and a lot of the Allied vehicles, that was never really a factor that was taken into account when they were designing them. And when a tank is hit, you have to bail ASAP. It isn't like a computer game where you can hang around in your vehicle. You got to get the fuck out real quick, essentially. And sometimes these tanks were just not designed with that in mind, so people would get stuck, or they would be unable to get out of one patch because it was blocked and there was no other exit. And eventually it's going to lead to being incinerated, usually, if you don't get out of the vehicle in time. So anyway, it's a fantastic book. It's morbid in the sense that tank combat is inherently a nasty business, but in terms of just talking about the vehicles and the way they evolved, particularly throughout the war years, it's brilliant, very educational, and I don't think there's much more a book of this subject could really cover. I don't think it could really be done much better at all. So I'd highly recommend it. If you're interested, I'd give it a read. And I'd say for me, I mean, I don't really like to give things a star rating, but this is certainly a 5-star book, if that really is even worth saying. But I think more importantly, all I'd say is if you're interested in the subject, it's brilliant. It's a truly good read.